Hello there, Voltage Modular people, PoohBear here, and welcome to my channel. And today we're going to be doing a technical overview of the FlipFlop Switcher. You could say this is a technical overview Mark II because I've done one in the past, but because there's been so many changes, I thought I'd do a total refresh. I will be getting onto some of the new stuff quite quickly. For those who have never seen a FlipFlop Switcher, you can think of the FlipFlop Switcher split into two halves, where we got the top half is to do with the logic side, and the bottom half is really to do with the routing side. And the logic side is deciding if we're in a flip and a flop, and then it's down to you to decide, well, if we're in the flip mode we might go out to X, and if we're in the flop we might go out to Y, or vice versa, but you're controlling what's coming down the channels. So a nice setup could be you might want to go out to X on the flip, and then you want to push it to Y on the flop. It could be that you've got an A and a B coming in, so on the flip it's going out to the X, and then on the flop B's going out to the X, and obviously you can have A going out to the X, B going out to the Y, and then on the flop you can swap them over, and there's all different kinds of combinations you can do. But we'll come back to that and have a look at that a little bit more in detail. So the logic side at the top is working out if we're in the flip and the flop mode, and it's working on a randomization process. It's working on a randomization process if you're in a pulse mode or you're doing your input trigger with an override. Again, I'll go into a bit more detail. It can be all kinds of signals what you're actually controlling externally. So the basic setup is, in the default setup, it's actually running in, it's got this pulse running. And you can change its pulse, and it goes as fast as 1/28th, and you can go all the way up to 256 bars basically. And whenever this pulses, it comes up with a new random number. At the moment, because the weight is set bang in the middle onto 0, it'd be a simple case of anything which is positive is going to go out to flip. Any 0 and negative will go out to flop. Now, this is, as I say, called a weighted system. So obviously what I can do is I can take this and say, oh, I'm going to start moving this over, and think of this color here, which is filling up, as the flop side. You can see if I speed this up, it's spending more time on the flip. And obviously the more and more I come round, so now we've got it's fully round, it's just really going to stay on the flip side. If I come just slightly under, every now and then it will switch onto the flop, and then it'll actually come back to the flip. But we might have to be sitting here waiting absolutely ages for doing that, because it is a randomization process. As you can see, as I start to move it down, we start to get more into the flop mode. If we go over this way, of course, now we've got more of that blue, it's going to be more into the flop. And as you go up and up and up, it'd be stuck more and more and more and more into the flop. So that's really the weight and the randomization process. And that's what's happening every time this pulses. Now we can override this pulse by using a trigger. And if you notice, as soon as I plug something in like a trigger, the pulse is no longer enabled. Oh, by the way, before I forget, we can reset this pulse by using this reset, and that resets the counter, internal counter. So I've got a number of my devices which obviously have some timing options on it. So when you hit reset, they all tie up together, so they're all in sync together. The trigger allows us to override what's ever happening to the pulse, so we can at any time decide to send off a trigger. Now it just happened to go into a flip and a flop then, but every time I hit go, it's not necessarily going to go from one to the other. It's going to, and when I hit go, it's going to say, right, let's do our random process. Where are we landing on a flip and a flop? So you could hit this, say, 3 times and stay in the flip, and then on the 4th it might go into the flop or something, you know. So it's a totally random process. And of course the weight, again, will be affected by that. So if I was to push it more over to this side, we should stay more onto the flip, and eventually we will go to the flop. We'll probably need to do quite a few more. You forget, when I had this running, obviously it was running quite fast. So there we go, we went into flop and straight back into the flip again. Let's reset that back to the middle. Above it, you've got this intrigue little light. This is appearing on a number of my devices. When it's off, it's working on the trigger principle of anything above 0 is going to be a trigger, and 0 and below will reset that trigger. When it's on, I refer to this as the voltage modular mode, which is anything above 2.5 volts will trigger it, and obviously below 2.5 will reset that trigger. For you Reason users, you're probably used to this mode where it's 0 and above. So it's a mode I decided I have in there because I do quite a lot of stuff, especially with pitch stuff, and it tends to be above the 0 volts, and that's where I find this really sort of handy to have that kind of thing in. So yeah, so in this trigger you can even have wire this up to a keyboard or coming out of an ARP, so every time it gates, it'll work out if it wants to do something or not, but we'll get into that. Now override is a real special one. And again, when we click on override, you notice obviously the trigger is disabled and the pulse is disabled. And in fact, the randomization process itself has been disabled. You may have noticed when I unplug this is now a wait. When I plug this in, it becomes like a threshold. So your external process could be anything, and the timing could be anything because it's yours. What we're looking for is you're going to take that signal, push it into here, and we're going to work on the principle, are you above or below this particular threshold, which we can obviously set. And obviously if you are, in this case, below, you're going to go into a flop. And if we now start to move my threshold, we're now going into a flip. So this is obviously flipping and flopping as I'm changing my threshold level here. So that's what that override does. So it's quite powerful function, what you can actually have here. On the threshold, by the way, we've got this offset. So this is quite good to have an LFO coming into this. So you can actually just change the offset on the fly. So you can, I like to maybe I might set it here, then I might have an LFO running, which is then obviously pushing it more into a flip mode from a flop mode and that sort of thing. So that's quite a good one to have. Now we've also got this random button. This is actually quite a special and makes this a little bit unique. And in fact, I might wire it up in a second. What this random process does is when you're using the pulse or the trigger, as I say, we've got this internal randomization process of working out if we're in the flip and the flop. And when this is enabled, we're actually passing that value down the A chain. So I refer to this as a chain because obviously we could have this random figure, we can have a constant which we can change, and we can have an input figure as well. And these are all added together to go down that A channel. On the B channel, you've just literally got the constant figure and the input, what you've got coming in. Yes, you can think of this, if you've got an input, you can think of these constants as offsets, but obviously when you unplug them, they become constants. So this random figure, the reason it's a little bit special is because in the flip mode, it will always be positive, and in the flop mode, it'll always be negative if this is set to 0. In fact, I don't know if that's actually set to 0. There we go, set to 0. If this is set to 0, as soon as you start changing the weight, then you are going to be affecting what figures are going to be appearing where. But you may find that very, very handy to actually have it. And in fact, what we should really do is start to just wire these things up so we can start seeing some of the results and start talking about some of the configurations down below. So let's get the random turned on. So at the moment, as you can see, I've just clicked, go twice. So I've got these two figures. Let's just keep going. Hey, I've got a negative value. So my negative value now is come down. It's obviously negatives automatically put it into the flop mode because that's what it's done internally. I'm actually passing that same value down the A chain, which is now come down here to say, well, actually in the flop mode, we're going to Y. Here's the Y. And there we go. Here's our value. Now, at the moment, you may notice that this has gone to a 0. We have these options down here, what we're going to do with it. But you also have to bear in mind is what's happening with the B chain. So we've got this option here called hold, and theoretically that should hold the last value if we switch away from it, but it won't in this particular case. It'll go back to a 0, and the reason it's going back to a 0 is, I say, because this B chain, we've got this constant value here. This 0 is now being passed through. So in the flop mode, it's got an X, so it's passing the 0 out. So if I was to put this to an off, and I was to put this to an off, we're now turned that totally off. So now what we're saying is, obviously in the flop mode, there's nothing coming down. So something's got to happen. So again, if we just quickly flip through our go, so I've now got myself a value, and what we're looking for it now is to go into a flop mode. There we go, it's going into a flop mode, but it's held that value. So it's like a sample and hold. So the last value which is coming out of there, it's going to remember. So it doesn't matter if you've got, say, something plugged into A and it's constantly changing, it's going to ignore that because obviously that constant change will be going to its Y, because that's how it's configured. But here's, say, the last value I actually sent out, in this particular case, happened to be 3.4 blah, blah, blah volts, and it's remembered that, so it works in the principle of a sample and hold. Obviously, if I was to put this to a 0 now, it's going to say, okay, I'm going to drop it to a 0 whenever I don't have anything coming to me. So it's just a simple little one to remember. So one of the things I like to set this up for is, say, passing, say, some pitch and gate data through. So when I'm passing the pitch through, I tend to pass it, say, through B. And what I have on B would be, so it might be, I'm going to set B up to go to Y, and then it's going to be off, and I'll have it on the hold. And then on the gate data, we'll have X, we'll have it on an off, but I'll have it on a 0. So if you think about it, so I've got some gate and pitch data coming through, and if I turn it off, well, what am I want to do with that pitch data? Usually you don't want to drop the pitch to 0 volts. It depends on what you're pitching and what you're going through, because you might cause legatos, you might, you glides and all kinds of sort of things you may cause because you suddenly dropped your voltage down to 0 volts. So by keeping it high, which is normal, and we're just turning the gate off, that's how principally things work in general. So we just hold that pitch value to its last sort of known value. And that's the kind of configuration I do use it for when I'm passing through gate and pitch data through this particular system. Of course, that randomization process would be off there because you wouldn't want to be randomizing what's going on with the gate. Now, just because, say, we've got this open, so this might be on a, we're going to go into a flop. Yay, a flip, sorry. So now we're on the flip. So this one's saying, hey, I'm going to X. Well, obviously, if this was, say, gate data, there's nothing stopping this gate data, say, pulsing 100 times, and that'll pulse through here 100 times. This is like I think of this as an outside gate, and your inside gate is whatever you want to do. You can open it 100 times. If this gate's closed, well, it doesn't matter. That data's going nowhere. Only when this gate's open are we going to pass the data through. You can also pass audio through this quite happily. Again, in a number of my demonstrations, I've demonstrated where I actually put a bit of audio in and I'm flipping and flopping to do the panning. That's something I actually like to do. And again, in another module, you've probably seen it where I actually will take the pitch data, and I'll also have this, say, set to 1 volt. So that'd be like set up at 1 volts. And then I'll be flipping that in line with this one. So this would be on X, and that would be on X. And then over here, I just have this one, say, on X. So it's off. Usually I'll have something like that off. And what that will do is that's going to give you an octave jump. So, so every randomly, if you keep pressing the same key, you're going to get an octave jump up, which I use, like, say, doing some rocky sort of bass sort of stuff I tend to do. Okay, I'm definitely going into a little bit of a waffle mode there. I don't think there's really too much else. Obviously, we can double click on the bear and we can put it into dark mode. And that's basically it. Oh, there's just one little thing, I suppose, is if we were in the override mode, because I say we can have any kind of signal what we're doing on the outside, the randomization in this particular case is now a true random number. So in the flip or the flop stage, you're going to find it's no longer, as I said before, if you use dead center and was using these modes, the flip will always be positive, the flop would be negative. But with the override, that goes out the window because it doesn't know really what's what. So you can end up with minus and pluses coming out the flip, and obviously minus and pluses coming out the flop. It's a pure random number. It's now passing down this particular case because that's the whole point. It is a pure random number, whereas when we're using this other mode, we're using the internal random number, which is decided on the flip and the flop. So that's why it works that way. Does that make sense? I probably made that really confusing, and I should just shut up in the first place. But anyway, there you go. This is the FlipFlop Switcher. Have loads and loads of fun with it. I do. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.